Good evening. My name's Tim Dwyer. I'm the chair of CIBSE ASHRAE Group. So I'm very pleased to pass straight across to Tom Lawrence, who's speaking live from Atlanta, who will speak on whose green building standards are more effective, the US or Europe. So over to you, Tom.
All right, thank you, Tim. Most all of those places on there, the topic has been, sustainability related, green buildings, energy efficiency, air quality, indoor air quality. There's something along that line. And even though the people may look different, they may talk different. Even with the English speaking there, they look and talk different somewhat there. They're all solving the same problems. The same topics, the same issues are common across there. And so I'm realizing that, in the last several years in doing all this, and I try to put together what I learned from around the world and bring that into both my students in the classroom and also other people when I go around and meet and discuss with them. So what I want to cover here today during this time frame is, and I appreciate everybody being on during the evening time period, maybe a little busy for some people right here, but I want to discuss a little bit of this, just the terminology. We talk about codes or standards or rating systems or guidelines. What do they mean? We tend to, even people that know better tend to maybe overlap a little some of those terms or definitions. So I think it's worthwhile spending a few minutes talking about that. Then we'll go through an overview of what U.S. current status is in terms of these areas. We will also do the compare and contrast with the EU and the UK on this and their current status. I have some brief discussion on some other areas outside this because, again, they're developing some of the same things in parallel. And then we have some discussion. I won't say we have a vote on who's better. That's not my real personality to talk about, comparing who's better or not. I think I'm more along the lines of, I think we can all tend to learn from each other in terms of what we have. So let's just continue on and do this. So as I mentioned, I think it's important to have a good distinction in your mind of if you talk about a standard or a rating system or codes, and all these have been different vehicles and tools that have been used to move sustainability and green building practices into the mainstream there. So these are my definitions, I guess, or thinking of what would be. We can start off with and they're somewhat in order of level of strictness or how rigorous they are involved. You have guidelines that are, I call them more like suggestions or serving suggestions, or that a design project could use that would result in some improved in performance, either in energy or maybe in air quality or just an overall system design and how that works. ASHRAE's produced a series of advanced energy design guidelines for the last 10 years or so. They've been sponsored in part by the U.S. Department of Energy, which then allows ASHRAE to make those available for free downloads. And there's, I think the last I heard is like 500,000 different individual downloads have been done over the last several years on those. So it's, they've been widely disseminated. There's actually an ASHRAE research project going on right now that's trying to look at and see, well, how much impact have they really had? Compare buildings, or I think these are school buildings, they've been designed according to the design guides, or did they have an impact? It's a little hard to say sometimes about that. And then you can move on the next level to be something that would be like a rating system. BREEAM, LEED, there's Green Globes, there's a number of those that are around. They still tend to be generally voluntary in nature, meaning that they're not mandatory enforced, although that does depend on, in some situations, there are some cases where it's mandatory that a specific project might have to adapt to one or comply with one of the rating systems. There are specific credits typically that are set up, and so basically the idea is if you're designing a project, you would go through and making sure that the design that you are going with does meet the criteria that is set in the credits, because you want to earn that credit to achieve the certification. And then you can move a little bit down on the level there, talking about standards. And at least in the terminology that is used within ASHRAE circles, where they talk about a standard, it's generally a document that or set of criteria that has been crafted such that it could be almost like a legally enforceable document, and it meets acceptable requirements for some level of performance and whatever topic it's trying to address. And so you can have standards that are very specific, detailed, focused about how to perhaps do a certification of a specific product type or a piece of equipment, to a very, very broad-based in the sense of a standard that could be applied to a green building, and all the different levels of nuances that are involved with that. And then the next level, at least in terms of rigor and in terms of how to use, you could have something that's, say, a building code or code. That's something that would be adopted by a jurisdiction. It's a legally enforceable mechanism such that you have to comply with this level of performance, a level of design, minimum criteria. If not, then you're subject to legal penalties, fines, jail terms, whatever you want to talk about there. In many cases, the codes are based upon standards that have been created by other organizations, such as ASHRAE and others, that they just adopt those particular standards. So, that's a good to go through that overall discussion and see what that be. So when we talk about these, if you hear these terms, not just even on this webinar, but in the future, you realize that that's what we're really talking about. So let's spend a few minutes going through in terms of what's going on in the states nowadays in terms of what that. And so, one of the, I guess, the earliest parts of that, at least in the U.S., was created by the U.S. Green Building Council. It was formed in the mid-1990s. That group was basically, I actually had an opportunity to speak with some of the original founding members of that. Their goal was to basically transform the marketplace. And so the USGBC, that's their intent. They have a lot of other build on from that point, but that was the basic intent of the people who started that out. So the first vehicle or the way they chose to go about this was to create a program called LEED. It stands for Leadership, Energy, and Environmental Design. Always have heard several people sometimes over the years talk about LEED's program, and I've always joked to them, hope no offense taken to people on this call in the UK, but Leeds is a city in the UK that used to have a good football team. LEED is a different part of the program on that point. So it's a good acronym, the name for that point. I think it's talking about then leadership, and this trying to get the entire industry and the market to think about both energy, the environment, and the overall design process. Many cases now, we've seen, I know having some discussions about in the early 2000s with different people and saying they were wondering would LEED actually survive, and we didn't know at that time period, but obviously it has. It's still around. It's a basis for a number of different green building programs. The majority of the U.S. states, for the public buildings, for the governmental buildings, it's a requirement that they're looking at LEED certification, although there's been some backlash on that in several states here recently due to specific market forces that have been going on. It's grown from just being one program that talks about the building as a whole to now there's a number of different programs that are associated with building types or phases. You can have LEED for homes, LEED for schools. You can have the core and shell versus the fit out, and it's adapted, I guess, and grown in terms of the types of markets and types of buildings that it would go through and serve. And then look at the overall. So LEED is basically a voluntary program, or set up as a voluntary program. But then we started talking about how the building codes work in the U.S. In the mid-1990s, there was an organization that was formed. They called themselves the International Code Council. Very, grandiose name for just basically something that was a merger of three regional organizations in the U.S. that created the building codes. There's a good idea about that is now that they develop a standardized set of codes that are applicable, they can be used across all the 50 states and territories and jurisdictions in there. So that is when the states adopt parts of their building codes, they will select from what we call the I codes. So we have like the International Building Code, the National Plumbing Code. There's associated with that, and there's even some of the individual federal agencies, such as General Services Administration, which oversees all the U.S. federal buildings, and large number of floor area that's involved with that, the large number of buildings that are involved with the U.S. federal government all around. They also have adopted and enforce the I codes within their particular jurisdictions, because in many cases, like the federal government or the state government, my own university, we're in essence our own code officials, and so we can adapt and go through with whatever use there. So that's interesting to note that the U.S. federal government is adopting some of these, because when we start talking about green building codes, this is the way they can, they're basically in some ways the early adopters along that line. So both ASHRAE and the International Code Council in the latter half of the last decade, so basically starting in that 2005-2006 time frame, began to create a document or a standard or something that could be used as part of a building codes that look about sustainability features and green construction. So ASHRAE developed Standard 189.1. The initial release of that was in January 2010. The ICC developed what they call the International Green Construction Code, or the IGCC. That came on a couple years later, and so then you really had two parallel programs. Then very quickly after IGCC was released, the ASHRAE and the International Code Council reached an agreement such that Standard 189 would be included as an appendix in there, and it's a alternate compliance path for building projects. But in essence, you still had two parallel programs that are out there that are being used, which adds to some confusion. They both address similar and some of the same type of issues, but they're not exactly the same in terms of the format and the way they go about this. So, we look at the ASHRAE Standard 189.1. It is, it's an alternate compliance path. The official way that the codes are adopted in the U.S. is that a state or a local jurisdiction would adopt, let's say, the IGCC as part of their standard set of building codes, as an overlay code to all the other building codes, and then 189 standards included within that. Now, again, I talked about that as adding confusion, but realizing that we compare the standard, like a Standard 189.1, compared to the LEED program, which is primarily voluntarily. Within LEED, you can pick and choose which credits you want to go for, so you can have more of an emphasis on water efficiency or energy efficiency or the sustainable site, as opposed to others. The idea of having a standard such as 189.1 is that it sets a minimum criteria all across the board in terms of all the topical areas, and it does tend to push the envelope a little further beyond than what just standard LEED certification would be. We like to talk. We've done some comparisons, and I was on the committee that wrote 189. I'm still on the committee that's doing the continuous maintenance on that, and we think that basically complying with Standard 189.1 is sort of equivalent to about a LEED silver or high LEED silver level at that point. But the different approaches between Standard 189.1 and the International Green Construction Code, again, those are two parts of the same vehicle going about this. The ASHRAE standard combines both mandatory and then as a set of criteria, then either prescriptive or performance path for demonstrating compliance. Local jurisdictions can still change some of that, but it's not the standard's not well structured for along that line. It also includes a section at the end, and part of the construction and what we call plans for operation is that the plans for operation would be idea is that you're creating these documents to describe this is how we intend to operate this building, or this is what we need to do to operate this building to maintain some of the sustainability features that were required as part of this for being compliant with that. The International Green Construction Code is written by the people that write the codes. It's in a slightly, it's in a different style, different structure format. Still covers many of the same things, but there are variations along that point. Now, the good news is, I guess, in terms of maintaining quality in that point, is that starting in 2018, ASHRAE and ICC have agreed that they're going to merge the two, and so there will be one document that will come out of that. ASHRAE will take the responsibility for the technical criteria, and the International Code Council will formulate that in their normal code style. So that will keep it, it'll remove the redundancy, and it'll have something that people will be able to understand. Now, the IGCC and the 189 standard and basically most of LEED really deals with commercial buildings. Within the residential structure, there was a National Association of Home Builders in the U.S. that's created their own National Green Building Standard. It's simpler because, in a sense, residential is a different animal in terms of the construction process around the world. It's more of a spreadsheet based. You fill out and submit. So it's a simpler structure at that point. And there's also there was a Green Globes program that's in the U.S. that's available at that point. It hasn't really reached as much of a market penetration as you would say some of the others, but it is there. It's going forward for that point. So it probably puts a little more emphasis on the idea of the integrated design process there, which we wish we would have within the like a standard or codes a little hard to enforce in that point. So anyway, that's a quick overview of at least what we have going on in the U.S. right now. Give a quick summary of what's going on in the UK and EU. Many of you on this webinar could probably give this a little better than I could right now in terms of what there. But recognizing that you should be credited, giving the commendation to the UK, I guess, probably really establishing the first widespread program that could involve with sustainability and green buildings. With BREEAM, 25 years now it's been going on, and it takes a little different approach than some of the other programs have taken. It's good to see, the fact that recognizing in 2008, looking at both the design stage and also what happens even more importantly after construction to continue to operate buildings going about this. That's probably, I consider that as important as good design in the first place. If you can't maintain it and operate it properly, it's not going to perform the level that you think you're going about this. And it's interesting about 2008, about the same time that ASHRAE and when they were developing the 189 standard, recognizing that was an important part that included in the overall program. It benchmarks, looking at CO2 emissions, and interesting, by the way, that the 189 standard, when it gets into the energy performance part of that program, that also looks at doing CO2 emissions comparisons. And actually, if you're demonstrating compliance, you should have a carbon footprint, at least estimation, that would meet a level of criteria in terms of demonstrating compliance with that. It's interesting to see, and it's good to see that the versions that are created for this to be expanded beyond the UK. And that's a good part of that. It's many ways has had it's a seed, I guess, for the Green Globe programs and how that's been adopted and brought over into the U.S. You look at the overall process of how the rating system goes. It gets in that particular regards, it's something similar to that you might have, like the LEED program has. You look at minimum standards, which the LEED would call maybe prerequisites, and then you have different credits points that you can pick and choose from. There's innovation aspects of that, again, similar and parallel to what the LEED program has. It has different things you can do that might be above and beyond the normal, or looking for innovative, features to be brought into an overall design, and then you get a final score, and you get a certain level at that point. And then the lead would use different color levels. You got LEED certified or silver, gold, platinum, or you get this. It is a similar kind of rating, just that with your pass or not points. It's a different way of going about this, but basically covers it the same way. When I'm looking at and going through and trying to consider what's going on in Europe and European programs, and at least on a more comprehensive level, you only see things that a big focus, or most of the focus, tends to be on energy efficiency. I mean, you had a green building program launched about 10 years ago by the European Commission. The idea was looking at improving energy efficiency, non-residential buildings. Looks like really the biggest end result that came out of that was a process of benchmarking a number of buildings, and then that's been closed down now for a little over a year. The idea of that is putting the focus on the EPBD and what that would be. Again, all those are focused on part of the energy. As part of that, we had different in different countries related to the green building program. You had some in Switzerland and had what that would be. You also had some in France, and these are programs are set up specific within that specific country. But again, the biggest result that came out of that was just benchmarking what was being done, and it's been a lot of the effort in the last number of recent years has been focused on the Energy Performance Building Directive, or EPBD, which has been in existence now for roughly 10 years or so. The major renovation of that was done 5 years ago or so, and that's put a refocus on that point. The idea is to come up, across the different member states, a common methodology for calculating performance, setting some minimum standards across the board, the certification, public display, basically a rating system at that point. You see an example there on the diagram of a rating certificate, and the U.S. has adopted something similar along that line in terms of a building energy performance or rating system at that point. Giving a little out there so people put on public display of what the performance is going to be like, and the idea is made to kind of help encourage and force people to go on for that point. And then something that here that's done with EPDD that's just not really available, at least in the way the legal mechanism is set up in the U.S. right now, is having at least the ability to have regular inspection of the heating and cooling systems. There isn't a legal process in place that we have in the States that would allow something like that to happen there, which is kind of unfortunate going about this, but that's sort of a fact of life. So what we've had, in the most recent, recast of the EPBD the last 5 years is now trying to, working towards 2020, the whole idea of having a cost-effective, nearly net zero energy buildings in terms of the design standards there, and that allows the different member states to come up with what they think would be cost-effective in their, depending upon their energy market, the energy prices, the weather, etc., all plays in there. So it gives a lot of flexibility to the different member states there, and in many ways it's sort of what goes on in the U.S. We just want to briefly run through, a few other countries or what other people were doing at that point. Don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because I want to get back to the compare and contrast. So the World Green Building Council is really just a network of local being in a sense an individual nation green building councils, but there's a number of those around. 100, there's a fairly large number of, if I can get 100 countries to agree on anything is a little difficult. But the idea of that is to help strengthen those individual councils so they can do their work within their own country. India has been for, I think it's about 12 years ago or so now, has come around and they've actually taken a variation on the LEED program, is adopted to their particular culture and climate. And it's been fairly widely received and having some impact on there. Hong Kong, I'm just giving you some examples of ones I know about personally going about for it. Hong Kong has its own green building organization that's trying to adapt this, and then Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, some of these travelers that have been around there have had a chance to sit in on some of the meetings and help with some of the planning as they develop their own programs there. Each one of those has to be developed for the specific local economy, the society, in some cases the climate. There are variations that are needed, to adapt it to the setup. And then, CIBSE and has gone out and has helped a number of other areas of that, these particular just list right here, see what they've been able to develop and do there. So, it's not just a US, UK, EU type thing, but it's actually growing around the world, and it's sort of related to my first slide when I was talking about jaunts around in like 28 different countries outside the U.S. in the last 10 years, so that I actually had a chance to see and talk with people about this. So I want to wrap up here with the last 10 minutes or so to talk about just comparisons of the different programs. And now we're going to focus back in on the U.S., EU, UK kind of thing at this point. But we'll put this back first to start in context with this, building codes, standards, whatever. There are some people that I've heard say in the U.S., and I'm not sure if same thing with in your case in the U.K. there, but probably similar. Or if people say that if I meet the energy code, or I meet the building codes, and they think, well, I'm good, and that's good enough. It's all about code minimum performance. And some think that if you meet that, then you're good. Well, that's, many of those cases, those standards or their codes, or at least energy codes in the U.S., were, the least bad you can be, as opposed to setting some chinny bar to try to get up to. It's just sort of a floor threshold that should be about this. And in particular, if you're really interested in trying to push sustainability and green buildings forward, we need to, be thinking beyond, the code minimum and look towards high performance buildings. In fact, if you look at the title of the ASHRAE 189 standard, is the standard for design of high performance green buildings. And so the whole idea of, what a high performance building is a whole separate topic we could spend talking about that we don't have time here right now, but that's trying to push that beyond that. So if you look at a little bit of just the comparisons, I guess, of how things are treated, in the U.S. and the EU, while we're going about this, implementation of the EPBD requires harmonization to the standards for energy performance between all member states. It's almost, in many ways that we have the same issues going on in the U.S. We've got all the different states that are, in essence, you can almost look at that as parallel to as separate countries in some ways, in the sense they have the freedom and flexibility to adopt and adapt building codes as they see fit. They have their own, the politics, the climates, the expectations differ all around. You have one set of common standards. Those are the I codes that are produced, and in particular, we're focused on the energy. There's energy code associated with that, but there are different year versions, and so every 3 years, those particular codes get updated. Standards over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a large push to increase the overall efficiency level there. So every 3 years, 2004, then 2007, there's a little bit of an improvement. 2007 to 2010, there was a big jump, and then 2010 to 2013, there's another big jump. And so you have, potentially out there a disparate group of looking for. And both EU and US comprise a wide range of climate differences that need to be part into that. So, the US has had an Energy Independence and Security Act was in 2007 came out. It was called for trying to work towards net zero energy buildings by 2030. I think since that time we've seen some similar things that EU is recognizing that has to factor in things like the economics and the climate availability at that point. The local jurisdictions in the U.S. are all can adapt and make modifications as they see fit in terms of how they go about this. And then, it's going to be, we saw, this on here, the Kyoto Protocol, but really, what's going on right now in Paris might actually have some influence on how things do going forward. It's good to see, maybe sensing the potential for some adaptation at that point. Whatever comes out of that, might put some focus on, how the efforts are structured and where we go moving forward. When I look at, how the approach in EU in terms of setting standards there, so I say more structured, at least in theory, than U.S. And by that I'm talking about, it's a rating systems or standards are set for starting with the individual products, setting up the needs and how this is used, and combining them all together. So and that's their set of criteria that is set. They're all, that at least intended to try to all work together. That could maybe good and bad. It looks like it's more organized and structured, but then it could become very confusing too, particularly if you're not familiar with all those there. ASHRAE in the U.S. kind of take more of a top-level, high-level approach. You have one standard that would define criteria for a lot of these things all at the same time. Say such as for energy or for green buildings going about this. We both developed over the last 5, 6, 7 years energy rating systems and energy labeling systems. They all look a lot alike. If you look at the ASHRAE one, you say, hey, it looks very similar to what's been done there. And they'll admit that they took that as at least inspiration going about this. Why, if something that looks like a good idea, why not go ahead and use it there. So, and the good thing about this is that both of these and both of those markets are becoming, in some cases, some jurisdictions where these are becoming more, they're becoming required. There are certain cities and localities now in the U.S., not done from a statewide basis yet, but at least individual cities where, the idea of having energy labeling or energy reporting is now becoming a mandatory part of that. And that's a good thing. The idea of if you're making more transparent what the energy performance would be can help, at least in theory, drive the market to pushing towards increasing energy efficiency in buildings. Within the U.S., there are different requirement tiers or attitudes that people think about this. There are still some states that have not adopted or enforced the energy code. It's kind of like, the government can't tell me what level of efficiency I've had to do, and you can imagine a whole from there. I don't want to go into that, but I think you understand that. They have some that would just a minimum code level. They'll do as bare minimum when they won't have to, and then there are others that are trying to push beyond that point. Getting X percent better than the current energy standards, or requiring LEED certification or other programs. By the nature of getting LEED certification, you have to prove that you're a certain percentage better than the minimum energy code there. And then even going on further on to the high performance green buildings and adaptation of high performance green building code like ASHRAE standard 189.1 or IGCC. There are cities and jurisdictions now that are requiring that going forward at that point. And also we have a trend that's going towards more performance-based than prescriptive. The attitude of the past has been more prescriptive. Prescriptive meaning, here's a set of criteria you can check off. I do this. I install equipment of a certain percentage, efficiency, etc. That sets my level of performance indirectly. And a lot of people have been saying for a while now that we really need to work toward performance, because that's what the ultimate objective is. If you look at the map of the U.S. and see there, in theory, every state is supposed to have had adopted a building energy code. It was all part of the energy stimulus and money that was put forth by U.S. Department of Energy after the last Great Recession there. And by the color coded on this, you can see how they would be. There's some states that are more progressive along those lines and then enforce them better. Others, they really either don't care or at least not enforcing it very well. And some of the states, maybe the laws are on the books, but really the truth is how well is it enforced and going about that. And that's really the importance of how that is. And that's a little harder to verify going about this. The last little slide on here, you was like, what does this got to do with energy codes at that point? But really, and that's related to, I guess, what's going about this. In terms of actually trying to advance this, I'm looking at some of the future versions of the green building codes or standards, looking at, you might call it the human factors or the human aspects of that, and having, tools available for looking at, interacting with a smart grid or the infrastructure for that point, having the people that are involved in the buildings, if they need to be involved in terms of maintaining a high performance or a net zero energy building, they need to be aware of that, know how to function with that. All of the operators and the people that are doing the maintenance on the equipment need to have knowledge of these high-performing, high-technology systems. And then really, from a societal level, we're not really going to move further along than we are right now if we don't get strong support from the public. If the general public does not want these things, they're not going to happen. And then if so, that's also maybe means things we've already put in place are going to be hard to go through and enforce. So, which is better? I guess we kind of asked this question right now: who wins? I like this. Is hopefully we work together and we can learn from each other and we all win. But maybe sometimes it's fun to have little games to talk about which one is better there. So I think with this we can open up to any kind of comments, questions, concerns, suggestions, or whatever, so we could see what other people are thinking about this.
Saram is speaking to us from the UAE, I believe. So let's see if we can just bring in Saram.
Standards based in the US or EU, referred in the IAQ and the water management category, about which relate to climatic conditions out in the US or in the EU. But in the Middle East, we have ambient conditions which are much different from what are those in the US. And whether the water management or from the IAQ point of view, or the native plants, or if you see the the terrestrial conditions about the plants and stuff, the Middle East, the temperatures, because of the high ambient temperatures, we cannot satisfy to a lot of criteria set by the LEED or BREEAM. So in that case, which you would suggest would be a better rating system which we need to choose for our buildings?
Okay, Tom, over to you.
Oh yeah, I mean that's. I can really think of my perspective of being on the ASHRAE Standard 189 committee, trying to keep within our own committee. We're trying to be aware of not just within the U.S., but it could potentially be adopted anywhere else outside there. So you also look at what is being recent adaptations of different climate zones. Recognition within the ASHRAE of a hot, dry, or hot, humid. So hot, dry would be obviously the climate that you're used to right there. Neither one of these areas, both the U.S. and the EU, have the exact same conditions that you have. We have parts of our country that are similar, but not the exact same. I think the best way I would look at it, and maybe if Bill's on here at the same time, is there needs to be local adaptations of that. I personally have had a lot of interest in seeing what could be done to these particular standards, so how they could be modified so they can be used in a more way readily across that point. So that's not really a strong answer on there, but I think that's I would look at something like like the 189 standard. This is a starting point, and then you have to there's always up to you to make some local adaptations of that. We're in the process right now on the 189 standard of seeing what we would need to do to adapt it to, say, the climate zone 0 dry, which would be in your parts of the world in terms of how to adapt.
Okay, Bill, over to you. Did you have anything? Do you just want to build on that? I know you had a particular point you wanted to make.
Oh, yeah. Well, the only thing I would add to that response was that anyone can submit a continuous maintenance proposal on an ASHRAE standard that's in maintenance that could address some of those issues if you have an idea of how to do it. But I think that ASHRAE has gotten the message that if they're going to be effectively global, they have to be effectively local with things like standards. So I think that's a very pertinent comment, and I think it's one that is being addressed. But my question had to do about two things. One is the ongoing low weight given to indoor environmental quality, and most or all of the green building standards, for example, LEED 4, 15% for all of IEQ, and about half of that is IAQ, and a little less than half is lighting, and you've got almost none for comfort and acoustics. And if you look at Green Mark in Singapore, the total there is 4% for all of IAQ, although they're raising that to 16. So, I think that certainly there's an underemphasis there that I hope the trends will change in the future. But there's another issue hiding behind that, which is that some green building practices may actually make IEQ worse. And I was going to mention a paper that was just published last week in Environmental Science, Water Research and Technology, where a survey was done of green buildings to look at their water quality. And what they found was considerably lengthened residence time in the building, factor of 2 or 3, but most importantly, quoting, chlorine and chloramine residuals are often completely absent in green building systems, and concentration of 16S RNA and opportunistic pathogen genus level genetic markers were 1 to 4 orders of magnitude higher in green versus conventional building. So I'm wondering whether the green building standard community is aware of and doing something about the potential adverse unintended consequences of green building practices that are intended to save energy and to save the environment and our water supplies outdoors.
Okay, thanks for that, Bill. Back to you, Tom.
Yeah, I actually, as you were saying that, Bill, like that's an interesting idea, and I don't think I ever thought about it. And I don't, I can pretty well attest, and sitting in on 10 years worth of 189 committee meetings, I'm not sure if that has ever come up. So really, maybe one way that would be addressed is actually looking at pipe sizing. That might only reduce the volume, so we decrease residence time inside a building. Is that one way that might help? I don't know.
Well, Bill's not going to be able to answer, so I've cut off his mic. But
okay. Yeah, well, that's I know. I was almost did the typical retort to us. Well, we have an idea of a continuous maintenance proposal. There it is. That we kind of turn that back, but that is something that. I think, in some cases, there's probably several examples of unintended consequences that we get from adapting some of these practices. I was seeing something else also about, earlier this year, I think, of a paper or a study was published talking about adaptations of, cool building, cool roof technologies, and having that point and potentially even increasing bad air quality in a dense urban environment in terms of, that has to do with the thermal stratification and other things going on with that. So, it's like a lot of things, it's hard to predict all the unintended consequences that come up, and I think that points out the really need to be the flexibility to be brought into this, and we learn as we go, going about.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Probably there's a question here which came in from Stuart in Geneseo, is it, New York? And he asks, really, with a spread of green standards outside of US, EU, UK, worldwide now, is there a case for more monitoring, auditing, policing of these assessments and certifications? He's got some experience from a particular area, and he said it now appears that there are so many accredited professionals addressing registered projects. It's difficult to know really whether we're progressing or not. Is that? Do you think that's the case? Are we having too much choice in assessment methods now and certification?
Was it reference to the too many number of methods, or talking about too many people?
Well,
too many certified people.
I think it's policing. Right. It's policing and auditing of the assessments and certifications that he's particularly concerned about.
Well, I know maybe Bill can think of. I can't. I'm not aware of anything that's a United Nations for green buildings kind of aspect of that point that really isn't there. In terms of the question is, how do we know if this is having any effect or not? Part of it just is, we have to trust at least it's better than having nothing going forward for that point. Having the certification programs that the different organizations, ASHRAE has those certifications, the others around there, I assume CIBSE probably has something similar on there. If they can, as these professional societies and organizations can prepare both the continuing education and also the initial training and perhaps in some cases testing to verify that at least the person has the basic understandings, then going forward you have to trust that point. And until we get to the situation where you have, say for example, it being part of a national enforced code and part of the building codes and the overall mechanisms in place where this is considered just as important as health and safety, fire safety, structural, electrical, all that. Until we get to that point, it is going to be somewhat of a hit and miss in terms of the overall level of quality of that. That's my own personal opinion.
Okay, well, just to follow on from your response there, Mike Barker in South Africa, who's a regular correspondent both with ASHRAE and CIBSE, his opinion is that with so many of these rating systems now available, there's a lack of probably sustainability in the rating systems, and his opinion that probably we're going to go down to just 2 or 3 main tools in 10 years' time, perhaps LEED, BREEAM, and a Chinese rating tool, which may make some sense, of course. And building on that one, again, I've got a question here from Germany. Bardil asks, we notice that she notices. I'm not too sure. Notices that the German standards were not mentioned. Where does things like Passive House certification fall into this?
Well, I didn't have time to kind of put it all up there and realizing that, I do, having spent a lot of time in Germany myself the last several years and do a lot of collaboration with people there, there is a lot of good things going on in Germany along those lines, and so I didn't mean to fault anyone or slight anyone on that point. I'm sorry about that. I want to just talk about your previous comment there. I think you're right. In some ways, what we had going 20, 25 years ago, you had 1, 2, or 3 systems that were developed and put in place. BREEAM, LEED, and then the other countries and other places around the world began to see those. They began to adapt their own or either modify it for their own local conditions or develop something on their own that was still based on those. And so you did get this proliferation of individual customized programs that were for that particular local environment. And I think tend to agree with you, Tim, if that was your own comment or that was the input you were receiving. I think we probably will see a standardization or pulling some of those together. Now there is, somewhat of an informal workaround that I've actually been able to see and observe over these different countries. There is, they do look at what other countries have done. And instead of trying to reinvent the wheel all the time with themselves, they've come up with how can we take what is done here or elsewhere and adapt at that point. And so, what the not enforcement, what the vehicles that's going to have that happen, someplace like, the World Green Building Council might be one way. There's others, I look at this as an opportunity for organizations like, ASHRAE and CIBSE and maybe REVA to kind of help take the lead and develop programs there. Each one of them has their own focus they go on this. I guess I do tend to be a little somewhat biased because I come from the ASHRAE hat, but I think ASHRAE is trying to we're trying to dominate the whole process going about this, but we probably were uniquely structured compared to most of the others to provide a a cross way of going about this, and I know I've personally been, trying to do what I can in my own little world of doing so, and have a personal interest in doing at that point. If I continue on being very active within ASHRAE, we'll see what much as we can try to do to help make that out. So that may be the way that we go about this. Is one or two or three organizations that begin to step up and establish some collaborations and partnerships, and maybe informal agreements to make that.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Whether ASHRAE's going to lead the gang or not is still in the pot, I think, and there's a lot of people in the marketplace. So let's interesting question here. This comes from John. He's in Westlake in the US, and he comments that. Interesting, he's heard discussions about public requirements for buildings to have a rating or grade. And of course, John, that's a requirement increasingly in the UK and in Europe now. With buildings have to have an energy certificate increasingly. And he asks the purpose of should there be a grade similar to Energy Star system? I guess he's really pointing to the US here. And that is, he feels that the purpose could be to make energy performance more relevant to purchasing, selling, or renting of buildings or spaces. Well, Tom, I don't know if you've got anything to say on it. I know there's a lot of research going on to the effect of good rating systems, or building energy ratings on rental and purchase prices. I don't know if you've got anything you could pass on to John.
Yeah, well, I can pass on a couple of things. I know, McGraw-Hill has done a number of surveys of late in the last several years, in terms of comparing green buildings or buildings that are, say, LEED certified versus non, and what their actual market value at that point. They're because it's been around long enough, that area has allowed comparisons of, buildings that are and that are not, and see how their improvement or how they've maintained the market value. You have a commercial building can lease out at a higher rate, then that makes that that building more valuable. I think in terms of answering your specific question about the energy performance rating, that is the reasoning, or that's not the reason why it was adopted. But say, take New York City as an example. I think it was one of the first, if not the first, large city in the U.S. to adopt an energy performance rating. They were doing it meaning the government was doing that for one mechanism in terms of just improving overall environmental performance. But in terms of what benefits in for the actual building owners, I haven't personally seen anything on there, but I haven't really gone looking for doing a literature survey. So there's actually been some good peer-reviewed type research papers on that, but that would be interesting to see. And Tim, if you've heard anything, let me know, and we'll try to keep an eye out at that point. You would expect it almost would have to, just by classic economics, but and then the McGraw-Hill survey on commercial buildings in terms of like green buildings, has demonstrated that. I wouldn't be surprised if you see some of that effect also with the energy performance.
Yeah, well, there are certain areas of research covering this, and I think I referred to one in my January article in the CIBSE journal. So pick that up, and you'll be able to find that in the CPD section. Okay, let's. Oh, just a comment here. Really building on a discussion earlier of how the standards that are available perhaps don't represent conditions in UAE and the Middle East. Well, of course, one of the areas, one of the standards that do, or one of the rating systems that do, of course, is Estidama, which was based really on LEED and others, and compiled to suit the UAE climate. So there are already energy rating systems available, and thanks for Mohammed from I think Dubai. He's put that note into us. We're coming close to the end. I want to try and pick up a couple more questions, if that's okay. And let's just pick one. This is the first question I had in today, actually, and this came from Andrew Rhodes, and Andrew is listening in San Francisco. So welcome, Andrew. And Andrew said, should rating systems allow more flexibility in meeting credits? So it lets the designers design. It's a common complaint, I know, but or common observation. What do you think, Tom?
Well, on that line, he's talking about rating systems, and that would be, say LEED, where you do get a choice to pick and choose somewhat along there. Yeah, that would be great. And then I think the best way to achieve that is doing what you really bring up is the performance versus prescriptive type set of criteria you pass or not. And it's a little hard to see how that would be done within LEED. Or I could see, like, say, within energy or something like that, you could have and that's where they get the energy optimization credits that are in part of that. Then there's other aspects within the codes or standards such as IGCC or ASHRAE Standard 189.1. Now that's where you get into the prescriptive versus the performance, two different compliance paths. And so prescriptive is very rigid in terms of you have to do all these things, whereas the performance allows you as much flexibility as possible once you've met the mandatory prerequisites. It does give the flexibility there. So I think if you look on the lines of the codes and standards, that has been brought in, and there will probably there's a trend more towards that, and Bill Bonfleth, if he's still on here, can attest to some work that's going on to look at different at least pilot programs of how building performance could be the primary goal as opposed to a prescriptive part of that.
Okay, we haven't got time to pick up on Bill, unfortunately, now, but just a comment really from a final comment from Lauren. And I guess, Lauren, you're from the UK. Any chance we've had to have a comment from the UK, I think, so far. And Lauren is commenting that the UK government has scrapped a lot of the requirements for zero carbon homes. And do you see this as being detrimental to the progress of environmental standards? Do you think people are going to struggle, or perhaps not look at the ways to meet standards in such a positive way without government intervention, let's say?
Okay, if the question is without government intervention, that's one part of that. So if you're say you're scrapping standards altogether, yeah, I think that's a problem. And we're seeing in the U.S. in some cases where certain states, the state where I live at, we had passed through the legislatures that state buildings could no longer go for LEED certification because you had one of the industries that was affected by one of the credit points, took offense to that and was able to convince people that this was no good. That part of it is a problem. I guess back to the original aspect, if it's totally being scrapped and any kind of enforcement, no matter what, that is a problem. But if it's being scaled back along the lines of, say, the EPBD recast, I think I look at that as just being more realistic. I think we perhaps were setting out, 10 years or so ago, maybe a little unrealistic goals of where we could be in terms of like net zero energy buildings, net zero carbon. And now there's a sense of realism, at least what we can achieve in the next 10, 15 years or so going forward. And I would rather focus on that.
Thank you for your time given to us today. Fantastic presentation. It probably, I would guess, it is the most international ever of our audiences. We've got people from every time zone across the world actively on the call today, ranging from someone in Chennai who's obviously staying up late, right away across to someone in New Zealand who's got up early to be with us, and every
morning, right?
Yeah. So we've got everywhere in between. So fantastic audience. It's been great to hear your presentation.